Jack had long grown weary of the monotony of his life as a miner, the endless days spent in the suffocating darkness of underground tunnels robbing him of any sense of purpose or joy. The sunlit world above felt like a distant memory, a dream he could barely recall. We descended into the mine that morning. He was greeted by an unshakable feeling of unease, as if the labyrinthine tunnels were whispering his name, their very walls pulsing with some ancient, malevolent rhythm. Assigned to A, new exploratory route that day, Jack followed his team deep into the bowels of the earth, their headlamps casting ghostly shadows on the walls. But it wasn't long before his attention was drawn to a narrow, newly unearthed passage veering off from the main path. Something about it called to him, a silent pull he couldn't resist, and without a word to his companions, he slipped away into the shadows. The air in the passage was colder, heavier, as though he were walking into the lungs of some slumbering beast. Strange symbols carved into the rock seemed to glow faintly in the beam of his flashlight, shapes that defied logic and sent shivers crawling down his spine. The passage seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and narrowing, until at last it opened into a vast chamber unlike anything Jack had ever seen. The walls shimmered as if coated in a living, pulsating substance, and at the chamber's center stood a massive black stone, its surface smooth yet strangely alive, pulsing with a dim red light that seemed to draw Jack closer with every beat. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, but his feet moved of their own accord, his hand reaching out to touch the stone's surface. The moment his fingers made contact, the world around him shattered. The tunnel, the chamber, even the ground beneath his feet dissolved into an infinite void, and Jack found himself suspended in darkness, so complete it felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. In the oppressive silence, a whisper echoed, soft at first but growing louder, more insistent. "You found me. Now, we are one." The voice was neither male nor female, neither human nor inhuman, but it filled Jack's mind, pushing out his thoughts and replacing them with images he couldn't comprehend. Twisted landscapes, burning skies, and endless, riding shadows. As the whispers grew louder, the void around him began to take shape. Figures emerged from the darkness, their forms shifting and amorphous, with glowing white eyes that seemed to peer straight into his soul. The largest of these figures stepped forward, its presence overwhelming, and spoke in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. "Welcome, Jack. You belong to us now." Jack tried to scream, but no sound came out. He tried to move, but his body refused to obey. The shadows closed in, their forms writhing and merging, and as they touched him, he felt his mind fracturing, his memories and fears spilling out like blood into the void. He saw flashes of his childhood, his regrets, his dreams, all consumed by the darkness. Just as he was about to give in, a faint glimmer of light appeared in the distance, summoning every ounce of his will. Jack focused on that light, forcing his legs to move, each step an act of pure defiance against the crushing weight of the void. The shadows clawed at him, their whispers turning to screams, but he pressed on until he reached the light, a simple, ordinary miner's knife, glowing with the same red hue as the stone. Without thinking, he grabbed the knife and turned to face the shadows. They recoiled, hissing, as the blade cut through them like smoke. The largest figure roared in fury, its form dissolving as Jack struck it with the knife, and suddenly, he was back in the chamber. The stone before him now cracked and lifeless, but the whispers hadn't stopped. They were quieter now, lurking in the back of his mind, but they were there, and as Jack stumbled out of the mine, he knew he would never truly escape. The stone had marked him, its darkness a part of him now, and every night when he closed his eyes, he found himself back in that void, where the whispers waited, patient and unrelenting, for the day he would finally succumb. The dark forest, shrouded in moonlight that filtered through the dense canopy, was a place no one dared to enter. The townsfolk spoke of it as a realm where the air thrummed with secrets and the trees whispered stories that had lived for centuries. No one who ventured into its depths ever returned, and the few who did spoke of shadows that moved, of voices that called their names, and of an inescapable presence that thrived in the dark. Liam remembered his mother's tales of a chilling cry that rang out from the woods, a sound so bone-deep that it was said to be the forest itself calling for lost souls. That night, he and his friends, Mark, Lily, and Sam, decided to uncover the truth behind the legends, to see if the stories were real. Their breaths came in rapid, shallow gasps as they stepped into the underbrush, the moon's pale light casting strange, angular shadows on the forest floor. As they moved deeper, the quiet grew oppressive, and the rustling of leaves became a chorus of whispers, calling out in a language that was almost familiar, yet impossible to understand. The branches above seemed to shift and stretch, as if reaching out to grasp them, and an unnatural chill settled into their bones. "Maybe we should turn back," Mark muttered, his voice cracking with fear. His eyes darted nervously, catching glimpses of movement in the corners of his vision. But before anyone could respond, a low, guttural hum, broke through the silence. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, wrapping around them like a shroud. The group froze, listening as the forest seemed to breathe around them. The whispers grew louder, forming words that called out each of their names in a chorus that sent shivers down their spines. "It's just a wind," Lily said, but even she didn't believe her own words. She could feel the eyes of unseen things watching them from the dark, the pressure of their presence bearing down on her. The air grew colder, and Sam shivered, his breath visible in the sharp night. He glanced at Liam, who stood rigid, staring into the depths of the trees. "They're not just stories," Liam whispered, the realization sinking into his chest like a stone. Suddenly, the forest erupted in a chorus of howls, an ear-splitting cacophony that made the ground tremble. The whispering voices escalated into a cacophony of shrieks, and the group found themselves surrounded by shadows that moved in impossible, unnatural ways. Every instinct in Liam's body screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The forest had them. It had always had them. A figure stepped out from the darkness, moving with an otherworldly fluidity. Its body was impossibly thin, its eyes too gleaming, hollow voids that seemed to pierce through the fabric of reality itself. The creature's mouth stretched wide, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth that glistened in the dim moonlight. The forest whispers coalesced into a single voice that echoed in Liam's mind, chanting his name over and over, a promise and a warning all in one. "Run," Sam rasped, his voice quivering as he grabbed Lily's arm, pulling her away. But it was too late. The trees, now bending and twisting as if alive, began to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. Mark screamed as he tried to push through the brambles, but the thorns tore at his skin, pulling him back. The creature, its limbs now reaching impossibly long, moved forward, and the moon was swallowed by the forest canopy, plunging them into darkness. They stumbled through the underbrush, tripping over roots and falling to the forest floor. Liam felt the weight of the forest pressing against him, the whispers intensifying as if it were celebrating their fear. He glanced over his shoulder and saw them. Others, moving among the trees, figures with hollow eyes and distorted limbs, shadows that weren't quite human. The forest wasn't just alive. It was a sentient, malevolent entity that wanted them, that needed them to become a part of its twisted existence. "Over here," Lily screamed, her voice hoarse as she found an opening between two giant oaks. They squeezed through, the bark scraping their arms, and found themselves in a clearing. But even here, the forest seemed to close in around them, the branches trembling with anticipation. And then they heard it, a deep, resonant growl that made their bones vibrate with terror. The creature appeared again, its form shifting, flickering between a human shape and something inhumanly grotesque. It stepped forward, and the clearing grew colder as the whispers reached their peak, a terrible, unified chorus. Liam's eyes went wide as the creature raised its head, its voice joining in the cacophony. It spoke in a language they couldn't comprehend, but the meaning was clear. They belonged to the forest now. The last thing Liam saw before the idea what he was walking into. The town was a relic from another time. Its cobblestone streets cracked with age, and buildings that leaned precariously as if bowing under the weight of their own history. The townspeople were an enigmatic lot, speaking only in whispers and eyeing him with suspicion whenever he walked past. The locals warned him about the forest that bordered the town, a dense, dark thicket that stretched for miles and seemed to breathe with an eerie life of its own. No one entered the forest, and those who did were never seen again. At first, Ethan laughed off the warnings. He was an outsider, a journalist looking for a story, something that would elevate his career and make him known for more than just writing fluff pieces about local events. But as the days wore on and the whispers around town grew louder, he started to wonder if there was more to the stories than he'd first thought. One evening, unable to resist the urge to find out the truth, Ethan slipped away from the safety of his rented room and ventured into the forest under the pale glow of the moon. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. The chirping of crickets and distant howls of wolves faded into a suffocating silence. The forest floor was slick with moisture, and the trees grew so thick that they blocked out most of the moonlight, casting everything in a strange, cold twilight. It wasn't long before he felt the first prickle of unease, as if the air around him had thickened and grown heavy with unseen eyes. That was when he heard it, a soft, melodic humming that seemed to come from deep within the woods. Ethan's pulse quickened, but his curiosity pushed him forward. The humming turned into a low, guttural chant. Words that were unfamiliar, yet somehow familiar, like an echo of something buried deep in his childhood. He stepped forward, eyes straining to catch a glimpse of the source. A pair of bright, green eyes reflected the dim light, and a shiver raced down his spine. The creature was thin, almost skeletal, and moved with a fluid grace that defied logic. Its face was pale and smooth, with no discernible features other than the deep, hollow eyes that seemed to pull him in, drowning him in an abyss of dark, endless night. Ethan couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as the chant rose in volume, a discordant choir of voices that wrapped around him like chains. He blinked, and, for just a moment, the forest around him shifted. The trees seemed to reach out, their branches writhing like dark, hungry fingers. The ground trembled, and a sudden, sharp screech split the air, making Ethan's vision swim. When he woke up, he was lying in the clearing, surrounded by the glow of fireflies that flickered like stars caught in a storm. The creature was gone, but the forest had not returned to normal. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the same soft chant echoed in his mind. He could no longer tell where the forest ended and his mind began, as if the two had become one. The next morning, Ethan left Raven's Hollow, but the memory of the forest followed him, persistent and unrelenting. At first, he tried to dismiss it, but the whispers became a constant in his life, a reminder that something in those woods had claimed him, something that was always waiting, always watching. Ethan's nights were filled with nightmares, vivid and cruel. The forest came alive in his dreams, the creatures within it shifting and chittering as the whispers filled the dark. The air grew cold, and sometimes he could feel the weight of eyes watching him from the edges of his vision, even when he was wide awake. The locals, now looking at him with pity rather than suspicion, noticed the change in him. His once bright eyes were hollow, sunken with exhaustion and the weight of unspeakable fear. It wasn't long before he discovered that he was not alone in his suffering. The town historian, an elderly woman named Margaret, found him one afternoon at the edge of the forest and told him the stories that even the bravest townsfolk dared not repeat. Raven's Hollow was built on the ruins of an ancient civilization, one that had worshipped dark and forgotten gods. The forest was their prison, their final resting place, but sometimes the shadows stirred, reaching out for the living, hungry for their return. Margaret spoke of the forgotten ones, beings of shadow and bone, ancient and relentless. They were the first of the forest, cursed to roam the twilight for eternity. Their eyes, green like the poisonous glow of fungus, were said to be a mark of their power, a beacon for those who dared enter their domain. Ethan realized with a sickening jolt that he had already seen them. Those eyes, those hungry, unblinking eyes. The whispers grew louder, now even louder than the beating of his heart. Ethan knew the forest was calling him back, deeper this time, to a place where the roots of the trees were not earth, but something far more sinister. He could no longer resist. He followed the call, unable to stop himself, as if the forest were pulling at the strings of his soul. He ventured into the forest once more, this time without the lantern that had guided him before. The shadows wrapped around him like a living shroud, and the whispered chant rose to a piercing crescendo. The trees seemed to groan as if they, too, were alive and in pain. Suddenly, the clearing from his first night appeared, the place where he had first seen the creature, but it was not empty. It was filled with eyes, hundreds of eyes, and in the center stood the thing he had seen before, only now it was not alone. The Forgotten Ones were emerging from the darkness, their twisted limbs bending in ways that made his skin crawl. The humming, the chanting, the eyes, it all made sense now. They were calling him back to the heart of their realm, to become part of the forest's eternal chorus. As they approached, their hollow eyes fixed on him, Ethan felt his body freeze. A voice, ancient and terrifying, echoed in his mind, speaking in the same tongue he had heard that first night. "You have come home." The whispers were no longer just in his mind. They surrounded him, filled him, a chorus of 1,000 voices that told him he would never leave this place again. The last thing Ethan saw before the darkness claimed him was the forest, alive with movement, shifting to consume him whole, and the eyes of the Forgotten Ones waiting. Remember, the darkness always holds a story. Until the next terrifying tale, stay tuned with Campfire Horror Story.